It's Berlin briefing time, just over 5 weeks before Germans go to the polls in those snap elections. So high time to talk about those election programs of the various parties. And that's why I have the full quad of political correspondents with me here in the studio to talk about those election programs, which are read by very few voters and very few politicians in the end actually stick to them. That's why we'll talk about the dynamics in this election campaign. And I want to just introduce Giulia Saudelli, who's here with me, Matthew Moore. I have Nina Haase with me, and we're all wearing headphones because this, after all, is also a podcast that we hope everybody will listen into carefully about what the differences and the similarities are. But let me start with Nina. You were just at the SPD party conference, which turned into something of a coronation of the current Chancellor Olaf Scholz here in Germany. And I just want to start off with a soundbite where he explains what these elections are all about for him.
Die ganz normalen Leute, die ganz normalen Leute, die ganz normalen Leute, auf dem Rücken der ganz normalen Leute, die ganz normalen Leute, die ganz normalen Leute, die normalen Leute, die ganz normalen Leute, vor allem die ganz normalen Leute.
Nina, what's normalen Leute?
Yeah, that is the one expression in German that people will hopefully have learned come February the 23rd in the eyes of the Social Democrats, that the ganz normalen Leute are the ordinary people. And Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor candidate and of course current Chancellor as well, made it very clear that he's not talking about the simple people, die einfachen Leute. He's talking about normal people who get up in the mornings, go to work, do their jobs, want their children in a good school system. They perhaps have somebody at home who they need to care for, so some parent or grandparents. So they want to have a system in place where they don't need to worry too much about politics, and they're very concerned with getting stuff done every day. And that was the message from the Social Democrats from the party convention. They said we're doing politics for the millions and not for the millionaires. And of course, that is a very subtle hint that we should also talk about the differences between the Social Democrats and their main rival that they see, Friedrich Merz from the Conservatives, because that is also a message coming out from the SPD. Friedrich Merz is a millionaire who goes around flying in his helicopter and has no idea what the normal people in Germany actually want.
Well, and he used that phrase actually 17 times, the normalen Leute. If you ask the normale Leute, ordinary Germans, they just in the latest poll gave us a chart of what the key issues are that they are concerned about. Migration was in top spot. After that, it was in the economy. And that's why I want to jump to you, Matt. You were at the AfD, the Alternative for Germany party convention, the far-right party here in Germany, which has no chance of getting into government because nobody else wants to work with them. At the same time, they've really been driving this migration agenda. Let's just take a listen to Alice Weidel, the party leader.
Cancel social benefits for those who are not authorised to stay and carry out repatriations on a grand scale. And I have to tell you quite honestly, if it's called remigration, then it's called remigration.
So, remigration, the buzzword, the no-go word, as it has been labelled here in Germany. She was deliberately breaking a taboo there, wasn't she?
That's right. So, to give this some context, this was a word that is very popular in the Neue Rechte scene. This is the far-right extremist scene here in Europe, the Identitären Bewegung. There'll be people who know the name Martin Zehner. This is a word that he uses for his cries, for his circle of people, and for that scene. It means the deportation, the return of people from Europe who have migration backgrounds. That includes people with citizenship. So a highly controversial word, a word that is very toxic in many places. So to put that in your speech, at your Parteitag, at your party conference, is a significant lunge to the right, I would say. It's also now in their programme. They've said that they're going to have a remigration catalogue, and that essentially means things like we just heard, making it harder for people to access asylum here in Germany. Cutting benefits for people with asylum, making sure that people who've had their asylum applications revoked, basically getting nothing but bread, bed and soap. And where necessary, when people who have been given asylum, the need for that asylum is over, hence therefore the war in Syria is one that they talk about, that they would see that the opportunity for remigration. When you ask them, does this include people with German citizenship? They say no. People with German citizenship are fine. However, there are people for whom it does include people. There are people that are listening to that and hear a different message. And there are people within the party who hear a different message.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point, because the conservative CDU-CSU, led by Friedrich Merz, who I was seeing at the party gathering his party had in Hamburg, they are somewhat similar in some of the rhetoric. The conservative CDU-CSU has been accused of actually taking some of the messages from the AfD. For instance, it is now demanding that migrants be rejected at the border. They're also bringing into play that there would be a potential to strip people of German citizenship if they also have another citizenship and are proved to be criminals. And this was in the aftermath of that attack on a Christmas market here in Germany, where Friedrich Merz, who's the current front runner in the polls and actually has the highest chance of becoming the next chancellor, was quoted and sent that clear message that Germany needs to be a lot more restrictive on overall migration. And I just want to contrast this with what he said when it comes to the nitty-gritty, when it comes to migrants that Germany needs. Let's just take a listen to what Friedrich Merz, while saying he wants to turn away migrants at the border, says about migration overall.
We need people who want to work in Germany and can. And getting those people faster access into Germany is just as important a task as turning away those who come in numbers that are way too large.
It sounds like a social democrat there.
Sounds like a social democrat, but I'd like to bring you in, Giulia. How similar does he sound to the Greens?
Yeah, we can see that a lot of talking points from the CDU, from the Conservatives, but sometimes also from the AfD have kind of seeped into the discourse of the Green Party. We also read in their program, which is for now still a draft. It still has to be approved by the party Congress next weekend. But we can read there that there's some terms creeping in that they wouldn't necessarily have addressed in their past programs. For example, repatriations. They say that they are necessary when people don't have the right to stay in Germany. They say that in particular the repatriation of criminals has to be given priority. They also mention, for example, that they see the setting up of control centers outside of Europe to check there whether people can come to Germany and Europe in the first place. They are against that, but even the fact that they're mentioning this policy that we've seen, for example, applied from right-wing governments in Europe, like in Italy, they've tried to do that with Albania. We've seen that trying to happen in the UK, also by a right-wing government. The Greens just mentioning and acknowledging this plan means that this messaging, these topics that are being raised by the Conservatives and in part also by the AfD are actually having an impact on the Greens' policy on migration too, when they have been the one party that has been more open, more supportive of rights of asylum and migration and integration.
And I think, but the Greens party programme, I think in particular, is the one where you can see the current crises and how parties are having to adapt the most clearly. I mean, if we all look back to 2021, this was an election where top topics were essentially addressing the climate crisis, right? And the second one was the COVID restrictions. So now we're talking about completely different topics. So much has happened between 2021, the last federal election, and this time.
But one differentiation, of course, is in view of Syria, that both the Social Democrats and the Greens, they want to allow for Syrians to go back, visit the country without losing the status of asylum here in Germany. But overall, I really think it's an interesting point, and it explains the relevance of the Alternative for Germany, because we spend a lot of time talking about them, but they have been very successful in driving the political agenda about this issue that Germans clearly care about a lot here in Germany. I want to come to number 2 in the charts of what people are concerned about. And of course, it is the economy. We've just had the latest figures out. Germany is sliding further into a recession, the second successive year of negative growth, as it's called. So basically, it is a recession here in Germany. And Nina, this really is something that Olaf Scholz needs to be concerned about in particular, because he wants to get re-elected despite the fact that he is performing so poorly in the polls. How does he and how do the Social Democrats want to turn that one around?
Well, they still are convinced that they are on the right path. So anything you find...
Conviction never was a problem with them.
Never a problem. Also, bad polling is never a problem for them. They still think that a miracle can happen. I mean, they're currently in the polls, they're behind the Conservatives, they're behind the AfD, and in some polls they're even behind the Greens. So they're on 4. And Olaf Scholz is still convinced that he can do it. And he did do it in 2021. He came out of nowhere, no political debate about Olaf Scholz. Could he be the next German Chancellor at the time? Then the others made mistakes. That is something that you can never rule out, right? So that can still happen. But other than that, he's also very happy with how he has drafted plans for this country and blames it essentially on this non-functioning coalition government that he was the head of. He still believes that he has the right ideas, and that is why they call it the government program, their party program. I think that is very telling. And you also have to keep in mind that, of course, it was by no means a given that Olaf Scholz was going to become the SPD's chancellor candidate, right? Just a couple of weeks ago.
They had options.
They did have options, but then the much more popular defense minister, who in some polls was the most popular politician in Germany, you know, cross-party, everybody said Boris Pistorius is doing a good job. But he then said, no, I really don't want to challenge Olaf Scholz. So Olaf Scholz feels very safe at the moment, thinks that he's got a good plan. But you try and find out details from, you know, the economy, what he wants to change. And it's very much he wants to perfect some of the measures that the SPD have already tried to implement while they were in the governing coalition with the Greens and the FDP, some of the things that were blocked by the other, especially the FDP. But they also have some good ideas in there, like they want to implement a Germany fund where they say we need extra money. We need to create some sort of a fund that we can build those bridges. We need 100 billion euros now and need to invest in our infrastructure because that is in a terrible state. And anybody coming to Germany notices that for years and decades, not enough money was spent on that. So Olaf Scholz said we need extra debt. And they've also got this idea of implementing a made in Germany bonus, where they say, okay, any company, a bit like I think they looked over the pond there and thought, okay, we need to implement tools for companies and give them as incentives to invest in our country and give them tax breaks.
Although there's a huge difference, of course, towards with the Inflation Reduction Act, which is creating dynamics by giving tax breaks.
I was just talking about American interests and German interests.
I've got one question about the SPD programme. So I read parts of it and I thought it was interesting that the reintroduction of a wealth tax is in there. But he doesn't talk a lot about it.
The Greens have it as well.
Oh, so, Greens have Tax the Rich in their program, which I found quite strong coming from them.
But when you see, it's actually hugely, it's quite popular among the German public, a reintroduction of the wealth tax, because they think that things have got out of balance. 10 years ago, Thomas Piketty wrote a whole book about it. The Western world was talking about this inequality. He's got a reintroduction of the wealth tax in there, but doesn't spend a lot of time pounding that issue on the campaign. That's the feeling I have. Because he's worried about something, or why is that not front and centre?
I think they're trying to walk that fine line between making it clear to their voter base that, yes, we will tax the rich. The Greens say it out loud, but the SPD also have voters in their base that run companies, right, where they say we can't threaten them too much or else they might leave the country as well. But they are very clear in saying we need to make life easier and the tax system better for the 95% of people, and we need to make sure that our plans and tools are also refinanced essentially by the richest 1% of this society, that they have to contribute more.
So let's talk about Ukraine, because this is a point of friction within the still existing parties that are actually in government. There is a row that is being denied by Olaf Scholz that he allegedly is not supportive enough of funding that's supposed to head towards Ukraine. The Conservative CDU might potentially even play ball on that. Let's just take a listen on what Robert Habeck has to say about what he feels should be done for Ukraine.
Robert Habeck from the Greens.
We see that Ukraine is defending its right to freedom, to self-determination, and its right to exist. And we have promised our support. We know that peace, the keeping of peace in Europe, can only return if Putin does not emerge from this conflict stronger or victorious. As terrible as that is, and nobody finds it easy to talk about it. These are certainly the most difficult, also morally difficult decisions we have to make.
So, if anything, the Greens are now backing aid for Ukraine on that final stretch a lot more. Here's what Olaf Scholz is saying about it.
Perhaps I should have ended the coalition earlier, but I did in the end because there was disagreement about how we were going to find the money to support Ukraine, for example. We lack precisely what we have now earmarked for Ukraine in the draft budget, 12.5 billion euros. If we want to do more, we need even more. 15.5 billion, for example. And then the question is, who will pay for it? My suggestion, extra funding, and not at the expense of pensions or municipalities or whatever.
He keeps doing that, doesn't he? He keeps setting Ukraine aid against actual the social support network here in Germany. And investment.
His communication is very interesting because, of course, he blames all his critics and he accuses them of doing exactly that, of pitting aid for Ukraine against the normal, ordinary people here in Germany. And then he uses interviews like that where he essentially repeats that, okay, we have to choose between aid for Ukraine or money for normal people in Germany if you don't tell me how you want to finance it. And of course, when he was in that big row with the Greens and the FDP at the time, it didn't look like a big problem to take out extra money, apart from the FDP blocking that proposal. So at the time, for the Social Democrats, it didn't seem like a big deal. And in the end, the coalition government collapsed because of that very question. Can we find those 3 billion euros somewhere? And Christian Lindner from the FDP just said, no, I'm not going to take out extra debt. And that's where that whole debate then started. Where do we get the money from? And now it's interesting that it's the SPD that are saying, okay, I'm not so sure anymore. And we do need to find some extra funds. Or else we'll have to take it from the ordinary people. So not very consistent messaging on the part of Olaf Scholz. I do believe that he is convinced that Germany is firmly by Ukraine's side, and that he has shown that over the years, that Germany, behind the US, different statistics out there, of course, but they are in Europe Ukraine's most important supporter, and that he has driven that support for Ukraine here in Germany, but also in Europe. At the same time, he has to walk that line again because he doesn't want to annoy people within his own party and in the voter base that are very reluctant in addressing this topic even further and sending more money to Ukraine and essentially contributing more in military terms. He wants to have this image as the Chancellor of Peace as well. So a very, very fine line for him to walk.
Yeah, so the whole backstory you just told us about the arguments also between the coalition that got us to this point is really behind that label of the Chancellor for Peace, the Peace Chancellor. And that is the one issue, interestingly, where he managed to score in his otherwise completely historically disastrous disastrous polling.
Absolutely, Germans support that. They don't want an escalation of the war, and he is hammering home this message: I'm going to prevent an escalation. I'm not going to provoke Vladimir Putin to the point that he might consider attacking Germany.
And behind it is almost, it's become symbolic because it isn't necessarily seen as so relevant on the ground anymore, which is the Tower system, these cruise missiles, which are state of the art. They seem to be even better than the ones that are actually now being or have been used by Ukraine from the United States, Britain and France. And the conservative CDU party, represented by Friedrich Merz, who is the front runner in the polls, has assured that it would deliver those weapons, but the question now is whether it will even be necessary, because as we talk here, we're awaiting the inauguration of Donald Trump for his second term. And this is where I want to bring the whole question of the US, because the battle is somewhat changed here now. You know, will the Europeans actually even sit at the table when the future of Ukraine is discussed? I got the opportunity to ask Friedrich Merz at a party event on what his message to Donald Trump would be. Let's take a listen to that.
Talking about the US, Ms. Küfner, before we start sending messages to the US, we should coordinate more closely at the European level. And I already suggested months ago we should have our own European contact group on Ukraine.
So clearly, his message is that Germany's task is Europe, and once again, Europe to be stronger. I want to bring in you, Matt, because a lot of headlines were made by Alice Weidel, the Chancellor candidate of the AfD, doing a Twitter space, an X space, with Elon Musk, who is an advisor of Donald Trump, one of his bros, actually, one of his key buddies in this election campaign. And it made everybody feel like, okay, these interests are very much aligned. They're very close to each other. The AfD is close to the Trump camp. But this is what Alice Weidel had to say about the relationship to the US and Russia, actually.
Die Alternative für Deutschland, unsere geliebte
The alternative for Germany, our beloved party, our beloved project for Germany, is the only party that has all communication channels open in the East and in the West.
Westen.
Well, that's not true, though. You know, that we've got the new party, BSW, where you also did an episode with, well, we did here at Berlin Briefing, the new Sarah Wagenknecht Alliance, and we just heard that in Russia they're very happy that, you know, when they look at the party manifestos, they clearly have defined the AfD and the BSW as the most promising parties here in Germany.
Well, and the Americans have defined the AfD also as the most promising party. Figure that. Explain that to us.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say the Americans, because it is just Elon Musk,
Yes.
who's South African and is kind of mixing it up. But in a way, she's got a point, because BSV is not keeping channels
the
open with.
Sarah
The Sarah Wagenknecht Alliance is not pro-American in the way that Alice Weidel is trying to kind of portray herself there. She said, you know, there's been a lot of excitement recently about this party, talking about the Elon Musk attention that they've had, the endorsement. And I think it was important for her in that moment to underline that the party is not becoming a kind of singularly pro-American party, because there are people, lots of voters in the east of Germany and in the west of Germany, but predominantly the east, for whom that is not okay.
She also went to a Republican think tank and spoke of Germans as being an enslaved nation and how they would stand up against US interests as well.
Yeah, so she's been doing a lot of media that is trying to kind of at least tell the story of the AfD to an Anglo or American American audience, right? But what was interesting about that is that, you know, she's saying, oh, we're keeping the channels open to East and West, and that's unlike any other party. And what their program for government says is that we want to rebuild Nord Stream 2, North Stream, the gas pipeline between Russia and Germany that was blown up, that is opposed by the US, essentially, is politically dead.
Yeah.
But
we
also by all the countries that are between here and Russia, right? Because it bypasses Ukraine completely, etc.
Yeah, so it's highly controversial. And to say that we are keeping communication channels open with the US at the same time as saying we need to drop sanctions on Russia and we want to start re-importing Russian gas, there's a kind of contradiction there, and a lot of people don't see how that makes sense. But that's their message right now.
Yeah, but it doesn't matter.
We can basically have good relations with everyone. And, I talk to people there and they say, like, we don't have friends. Countries don't have friends. They quote that. Countries don't have friends, they have interests. And we will have to assert our interests, and we will push through. And she said that, Alice Weidel said that in the to the think tank that you mentioned, Michaela. She said that she would be prepared to make that call with the US that we're going to start re-importing Russian gas, which is obviously controversial because at the moment Germany imports a lot of LNG from the US. And so I think that if Donald Trump hears that they're no longer going to be buying my gas, he might be upset about that.
Again, the AfD won't come into office, but at the same time, they really are a sounding board for the sentiment that many Germans have, particularly in those eastern states where they did very well in regional elections, where people don't want to be drawn into the conflict and people want to find an accommodation one way or another with Russia.
Which is also why when we're talking about the Conservatives' position on Ukraine, I think, they're just a lot cleverer at hiding their inner difficulties, but they've got exactly the same problem as the Social Democrats. They've got people, especially in the east of this country, who are firmly against supporting Ukraine a lot more because they say we need normal relations with Russia again. They don't say it out loud at the moment, but they do exist. And so Friedrich Merz is also having to navigate his own party between the people who say absolutely everything so that Vladimir Putin gets stopped also on the battlefield, and other people who say no, don't escalate.
No, but speaking to people within the party, actually, I mean, he's aware of that issue, particularly in the East, where his own people are faced with that particular conflict. At the same time, the conservative CDU-CSU is very clear in that they don't want to have Russian gas again. They want to stick with that. And they don't see a normal relationship with Russia anywhere near. And there's also a mathematical reality that we're heading towards on the 23rd of February, is that the eastern states where this pro-Russian course is very popular make up a fraction of the electorate. Like the big votes are in North Rhine-Westphalia, in the west, in the south, and not in the sparsely populated east. So we'll see a very different dynamic coming up there. But I just want to come to you, Giulia, because Robert Habeck is Vice Chancellor and Trade Minister. He was the one who actually had to wean Germany off Russian gas. And the Greens, along with the Social Democrats, according to the polls, speaking today, are the two potential coalition partners for a future potentially conservative-led government under Friedrich Merz. So will the Greens have to fix it? And where's Robert Habeck's stance on energy supply here in Germany and potentially shifting a bit away from those ambitious green goals?
Actually, if we look at, and this is something that's a bit surprising, why the Greens don't really talk that much about some of the successes that they've actually had in this last government. They were able quite suddenly, quite quickly to switch away from this cheap Russian gas, which was basically fueling Germany's industry, and to find alternative sources of energy, of gas, and to also be able to really push forward the building and the coming into fruition of renewable energy. And I don't really understand why they're not really pushing this a lot in the election campaign to show that they have actually been successful in these things. And obviously,
well, it's all about Robert Habeck and his charisma, clearly, because we see his face on all the posters.
Yeah, and this is not the sort of front of their party program. This is like the main election poster that we've seen coming up in German cities.
Can I just say that to everybody who's just listening, that we're showing the picture of Robert Habeck and the Greens Chancellor candidate, who really is all over on posters.
Yeah, and it's going to be tricky, I think, with the CDU if they do end up in a coalition together, especially on energy. They see things differently, the Greens. And I think the CDU has come to an acceptance of the fact that they need to push renewables because it is the future. It makes sense economically. You can't really come away from that. But there is some difference on, for example, the approach to nuclear energy. There is, for example, a difference on how much, for example, the Greens trust that in the future German industry can be powered by green hydrogen. The CDU is very skeptical of that. We've heard that also recently from Friedrich Merz. And the Greens are possibly going to have to make compromises on their climate policies, but they've done that before in this government. The FDP was definitely not an easy partner to try to find agreement with on these topics. We've seen that on combustion engine vehicles. There was not agreement there on other kinds of fuel. So that is one point where the Greens and the CDU might find especially difficulties in negotiating.
Can I ask one question about Ukraine and the party? So if we have a CDU Green coalition, are they going to deliver Taurus missiles to Ukraine?
Very likely. And the reason I'm no longer just saying no, which is what Friedrich Merz said a while back, is that he keeps saying yes, but attaches it to what allies do, who are actually already sending cruise missiles. But those allies are changing. Donald Trump is coming into the White House, and everybody's pretty clear that they're going to be in a different reality anyway. I mean, the elections are the 23rd of February. Donald Trump has vowed to end that conflict within 24 hours, which is not going to happen. But at the very least, there will be a very different reality that Germany would then have to decide to deliver those cruise missiles into or not. But I'm glad we've looked at all these different angles. Whoever comes into government will have to make concessions. There are always coalitions. It's almost like a political rule here in Germany. We're just ending the experiment of having three parties in a coalition, which clearly didn't work because it blew up. And we're already hearing from coming out of all parties that they don't want to do this coalition agreement kind of marriage contract concept anymore, where you basically have this huge contract at the beginning and you work down the points, because that was blown out of the water by the war in Ukraine and other factors. And everybody kind of feels that that was hindering them in actually readjusting policy.
This current government completely missed the point where they had two opportunities where they could have sat down and said, look, okay,
let's redo this.
Completely different situation now. Let's sit down again and let's reprioritize. And they didn't do that, which is why all the parties could always say, but it's in our treaty. Yeah, okay, that was before Russia's full-scale invasion that we agreed to do this and prioritize this. But whenever it suited them, they did use that as an argument for blocking certain
But I guess
projects.
the risk there is that if you try to renegotiate things and you find that you really disagree on things, then you risk your government actually not being able to continue. So I can understand why they might have not wanted to do that.
But they didn't want to risk what happened in the end anyway. And those 2 points, of course, were the Ukraine war and their own budget being blown out of the water by a constitutional court ruling that said you simply cannot do it that way. And suddenly dozens of billions of euros were short. So
and just one last thing. I find it also very, very interesting how the Greens have changed their profile. I mean, we started talking about that, right? How they are different to 4 years ago because, of course, the topics are completely different. Climate change no longer really featuring, and in everybody's perception, the Greens, when it comes to support for Ukraine, they're the party that gets named, where you have no doubt whatsoever what their position is. Everybody else has sort of inner problems and has to navigate between varying positions. The Greens,
and coming from
perceived as the security party, right?
Yeah, now. And that coming from the party that was perceived as the peace party, very close ties to the peace movement in Germany.
NATO.
Exactly, that's been a complete 180 turn, and the electorate seems to be going along with it.
So just to finish up, I'm going to put you all on the spot. Each of us is a close observer of one individual party. Just give me your prediction where that party that you know best will end up in these elections. Nina, Social Democrats, tell me.
Social Democrats, well, again, I'm saying that they're saying that they can still win this thing. How? We'll see. If they don't get beyond 20%, and I'm saying they're not going to get beyond 20%, then Olaf Scholz's political career is over.
At the moment, they're around about 14, 15, 16, depending on which poll you believe.
They might score a couple of more points because the other parties will have to explain a lot more in detail in the coming weeks. We'll have Donald Trump in office, and Olaf Scholz, with his careful approach to foreign policy, has a point with voters. So I wouldn't rule it out that they get to 20%, but I doubt that it'll be more.
Okay, personally, I'm responsible to take a close look at the CDU-CSU Conservative Union here in Germany. Friedrich Merz is their top candidate. He's also doing strongest in the polls, well, certainly the party polls, not the personal popularity polls. And they're above 30% now, so they're widely tipped to win. I predict, yes, they will win. The really interesting question is whether they go into a coalition with the Social Democrats or the Greens. My prediction would be that they would end up going into a coalition with the Greens, despite the fact that parts of them rule that out completely. So that should be an interesting one.
But how much percentage, how many percentage points would you give them?
Oh, well, I would give them, I think they're underpolling at the moment. I think they will end up being up at 35%. Matt.
Whoa.
Yeah.
35%. Yeah, okay. So I think that would be quite a remarkable result, actually, if the CDU got 35. I think
they're pushing the economy hard, and I think that will play a huge role, particularly when Donald Trump comes into it. Yeah.
So I think a lot can change in a matter of weeks, and I actually think that's underestimated how much can change. At the moment, the AfD is polling at, say, 20%. There was a poll at the weekend that had them at 22. I think they will probably get 23, 24%. And I think they will not be in power because of what you mentioned. The other parties don't want to work with them and have ruled that out. But that's okay for them. That helps their narrative that they're being kind of blocked out of the democratic process. And their aim is to get over 20% in this election. And if they get that, they'll be happy. And then they build on that. And they're counting on basically this firewall, this Brandmauer, as we call it, basically being chipped away over the next 5 years and being in a position where they can take part in a coalition government in 2029.
Okay, Giulia, you're observing the Greens.
The Greens, I think, well, now they're polling around where they landed in the last election, around 15%, 14%. I think that might be where they land in the end, because it seems like this is their sort of base voter constituency that will always vote for the Greens, whatever happens. I think we still have some time to see whether any one of the main candidates has a slip, if some other scandal breaks out. We never really know what can happen until the last minute. I don't necessarily see the campaign start going that well for the Greens. Habeck has already come under fire for some issues. So it depends a bit on how they play it, but I don't see them gaining that many points compared to how they're polling now.
So that was our roundup of predictions of the political party programs, and we very much look forward to your comments on what we believe could actually happen on February 23rd. We look forward even more to your comments once we know whether they were true or not. That was your Berlin briefing. You can see us, you can watch us on YouTube, you can listen to us everywhere you get your podcasts from. And of course, don't forget the weekly newsletter Berlin briefing, where you get instant analysis on what's happening in this election campaign and the full context of that. We look forward to talking to you, to hearing from you. Until next week, bye-bye.